City Council hearing for the Committee on Contracts. If you would like to testify, you must fill out a witness slip with one of the Sergeant at Arms. At this time, please silence all electronic devices and no one may approach the dais. Chair, we are ready to begin.
Good morning. Good afternoon, excuse me. It's already been a long day. My name's Lincoln Ressler. I have the great privilege of chairing our Contracts Committee, and I would firstly like to thank our speaker for that opportunity and for that privilege. I'm very grateful, and it's special to have Speaker Menon at our very first Contracts Committee hearing. We are joined by our Majority Whip, Camilla Hanks from the North Shore, and my good friend Gail Brewer, who served with me on GovOps and has chaired everything else but not contracts. As she stated today. I am very much looking forward to improving our contracting process and creating more transparency, accountability, and fairness in city spending. Our procurement process is painfully slow, rigid, and complex, and vendors, especially our nonprofit partners, wait far too long to be paid for their work. I'm truly excited to dig into this morass, and I'm grateful once again to Speaker Menon for the opportunity. I'm going to turn it over to Speaker Menon for her opening statement to start things off. And I just want to say how much I appreciate the Speaker's commitment to improving our procurement process, rooting out corruption, and identifying cost savings. The over-reliance on emergency contracts in previous administrations is indeed an area that needs urgent reform, and I commend the Speaker for making this a month one priority. Thank you so much, Speaker.
Thank you so much, Chair. And I'm so excited about this committee because I think what the goal that we really want to have is to try to restore people's faith in city government. And the contracting process is opaque, to say the least. And in addition, we are really focused on ending this practice of no bid contracts that go on for years and years and years where there's no competitive bidding. So that's what I'm really going to focus my comments on today. So thank you, Chair, for convening this important hearing. Our city procures over $42 billion in goods and services annually, but the current system is characterized by massive gaps in transparency and accountability. In fiscal year 2025, over 72% of all city contracts were registered late, meaning work had already begun before anyone even signed a contract. This lack of basic administrative discipline creates a culture where agencies can bypass standard contracting procedures and, quite frankly, undermine the integrity of our city's finances. The vulnerabilities in our emergency procurement system became clear during the pandemic. The de Blasio administration used executive orders to suspend controller oversight entirely and spent nearly $7 billion on emergency contracts. During that pandemic, Mayor de Blasio extended emergency procurements over 100 times. And I just want to be clear, an emergency means something that is of short duration. An emergency does not extend years and years and years. So we, again, are not trying to target any one particular administration. This has been happening for a very long time in city governments, and the results have been predictable. According to one controller audit, the Department of Sanitation awarded a $14 million food distribution contract to a company whose owner had pleaded guilty to obstructing the IRS just 1 month before receiving the contract, and which had no prior experience. I want to repeat, no prior experience in food delivery. That contract was terminated after just 3 weeks due to poor performance, but not before the city paid nearly $1.5 million for inadequate services. We learned the full scope of the waste when the city tried to recoup some of that pandemic spending by selling surplus equipment that it had purchased. Approximately $224 million worth of COVID supplies, including $12 million in unused ventilators, still in their original packaging, were auctioned off for roughly $500,000 or simply just given away. In fact, a junk dealer from Long Island purchased those unused ventilators for merely $8 per device. This amounted to just pennies on the dollar. Unfortunately, we did not learn from these mistakes. According to a controller report, by late 2023, the city had committed approximately $5.7 billion across 340 emergency contracts related to asylum seeker services. But the lack of coordination was staggering. Hourly rates for comparable positions varied widely from $58 to over $200 per hour across different contracts for performing literally the exact same work. That is unconscionable. Later, the $432 million DocGo contract became a symbol of everything that is wrong with our system. This was a no-bid emergency contract awarded to a medical services company with literally no experience in emergency housing. When Controller Lander declined to approve the contract in September 2023, citing serious concerns about vendor responsibility, the Adams administration proceeded anyway. The subsequent controller audit found millions wasted on unused hotel rooms, unauthorized subcontractors who were never, quite frankly, even properly vetted, and dangerous conditions, including mold in rooms that were housing asylum seekers. It even led to an investigation by the state attorney general over the scale of the fraud. This all could have been avoided with a proper system of checks and balances and competitive bidding, which, and I'm a former small business owner, any small business owner will tell you, you don't just take the first bid. You don't use no bid. You always do competitive bidding, which drives down the prices and makes sure that there's accountability and transparency. The Controller's 2023 report on emergency procurements further revealed systemic failures across the board. Nearly 85% of emergency contracts were submitted for registration more than 30 days after the work had already begun, which means vendors operated for months without finalized contracts or even proper oversight. Only 20% of emergency contracts had performance evaluations on file, and just 3.5% of emergency procurement dollars were awarded to MWBEs. These numbers represent a system that has abandoned basic principles of fiscal responsibility. These two crises, both the COVID crisis, of course, and the asylum seeker crisis, laid bare how emergencies are often used, quite frankly, as an excuse to avoid the competitive bidding rules that ensure taxpayers get a fair deal. Under current law, there's no time limit on emergency contracts, so they can go on in perpetuity. The administration can invoke emergency authority and operate under suspended oversight for months or even years on end, as we have seen. My first bill addresses the systemic abuse of the emergency procurement process. By limiting emergency contracts to 30-day terms and requiring a hard 15-day deadline for submission to the controller, we are ensuring that any future emergency is treated for what it is, a temporary state of action and not a blank check to subvert the law. The Adams administration extended emergency procurement powers for asylum seeker services for over 18 months. At a certain point, that's not an emergency anymore. It's just a workaround to avoid competitive bidding. The 30-day limit forces the administration to consider a simple question: is this still an emergency? The second bill I'm sponsoring targets a lack of visibility into subcontractor responsibility. Currently, prime contractors can use a web of subcontractors to hide conflicts of interest or provide false information to get a foot in the door. We saw this with bad landlords like David Levitin, who exploited loopholes to force the hire of his own maintenance and extermination companies without any competitive bidding whatsoever. A 2024 DOI report confirmed that these were not isolated incidents, citing hundreds of concerns at city-funded homeless shelters where executives held financial stakes in the very subcontractors that they were hiring. The controller also found that among 292 emergency contracts reviewed, only 73 had even one approved subcontractor recorded in the city's tracking systems. We literally don't know who's doing the work on most of these contracts. This legislation will finally bring these relationships into light, and sunlight is the best disinfectant, by requiring contractors to disclose the names and business addresses of every subcontractor's principal owners, their business histories, and any contractual relationships between the contractor and the subcontractors. We are also significantly increasing the penalties for those who attempt to defraud the city. The current fines have not been updated in decades and are often treated as a mere cost of doing business. This bill increases the maximum fine for fraudulent statements regarding bidders or subcontractors to $100,000, ensuring that lying to the City of New York actually carries a heavy price. In closing, I want to be clear about what these reforms represent. We have a new administration that campaigned on transparency and accountability, and these bills give Mayor Mamdani the tools to respond to future crises while maintaining the fiscal safeguards that New Yorkers deserve. And I want to be clear on the 30-day bill. If we need to go beyond 30-day bills, beyond 30 days, there are mechanisms in the bill to be able to do so, but in a very responsible way. But more importantly, these reforms are about building systems that work regardless of who occupies City Hall. Good procurement practices shouldn't depend on the integrity of any individual mayor. We owe it to the taxpayers to ensure that every single dollar spent is tied to a verifiable service and a responsible vendor. So thank you so much, and I will turn it back over to our contracts chair, Chair Ressler.
Thank you so much, Speaker Menon. Those were, I think, really powerful remarks about how much work we have to do to clean up our procurement process, especially our emergency procurements. And I really am thrilled about the legislation to ensure more transparency in subcontracting, where there's just been so much shady activity over the years. And I think this legislation will make a big difference. I also just want to take a moment to thank Director Yu for joining us today on relatively short notice. We really appreciate her presence. So we'll be, as the speaker noted, hearing 3 bills relating to emergency contracting. The first piece of legislation proposed by the speaker, as she noted, would limit emergency contracts to 30 days and require controller and corporation counsel approval for renewals. The second bill, as also proposed by the speaker, would require detailed tracking of subcontractors on all contracts and increase penalties for false statements tenfold. The third bill, proposed by our former contracts chair, Julie Wan, who did a great job leading this committee, would create a transparent, searchable public procurement database so New Yorkers can see how their money is being spent at every stage of the contracting process. Emergency contracting has increased dramatically over the past several years. From COVID to the asylum seeker crises, we saw endless emergency executive orders under the 2 previous administrations that resulted in thousands of emergency procurements. Thousands of emergency procurements. Gosh. During the asylum seeker emergency under Eric Adams, there were over 340 emergency contracts totaling $5.7 billion. Unfortunately, these contracts have resulted in numerous scandals. As the speaker mentioned, the infamous DocGo scandal, which Controller Lander did such a helpful job in uncovering. Another example that received less attention were that agencies like Health and Hospitals and NICEM, the New York City Emergency Management Agency, used the same DCAS master contract for security guards, but paid wildly different rates for the exact same service, wasting millions of our taxpayer dollars. A 2023 Controller report on emergency procurements reviewed 292 emergency contracts during the first 2 years of the Adams administration, totaling $1.7 billion. Only 43 of those contracts, 15% of the total, were submitted for registration within 30 days. So even though they didn't have to go through a competitive process, they only submitted 15% of the contracts to the Controller's office for review within 30 days. 234 contracts had no performance evaluations on file, and $60 million out of the $1.7 billion, just 3.5%, were awarded to MWBEs. So our emergency procurements are failing to invest in MWBEs across the board. It's of course essential that we have mechanisms in place during an emergency to expedite our painfully slow procurement process. When public health or public safety is at risk, city government needs to quickly and efficiently respond to serve New Yorkers. But emergency procurements should be limited to only when truly necessary. Emergencies that last for 4 years are no longer emergencies. They are simply new realities that must be handled through long-term planning and competitively bid contracts. Indeed, a competitive process yields better results. It yields better vendors at lower costs. We need deliberate policies to transition from emergency contracts to longer-term contracts to keep costs down, improve results, and strengthen oversight. We have also seen troubling fraud issues with subcontracting in both emergency and routine contracts. In 2020, investigators found a homeless shelter operator that received $500 million in city contracts. This gentleman has since gone to jail. They had a network of unreported subcontractors with no documentation of how funds were spent. A subsequent Department of Investigation report in 2024 found hundreds of compliance concerns relating to DHS shelter subcontractors despite new processes, including multiple instances where nonprofit executives had financial interests in for-profit subcontractors. I just want to say that, again, this is something that we've seen across the DHS system. Nonprofit organization holds the DHS contract, subcontracts out work to for-profit entities where leaders from the nonprofit are officers of the for-profit entity and getting paid again on the maintenance or security or other subcontracting work that's involved in the shelter system. It's disgraceful. The best way to effectively monitor contracting issues, let me just say, Speaker Menon's legislation would ensure that subcontractors cannot be used as a loophole around our contracting review and compliance standards. The best way to effectively monitor contracting issues is through increased transparency. Councilmember Wan's proposed legislation will do just that. Passport Public, under the Adams administration, was a positive step that enhanced the public's access to city procurement transactions. And through this legislation, we will be able to create a comprehensive database of city procurements that is easily searchable and accessible to all. The three pre-considered bills before us today take critical steps to close loopholes in our emergency procurement process so that regardless of who is in charge at City Hall, New Yorkers can trust that there will be accountability, transparency, and integrity in city contracts. While there was widespread corruption in the Adams administration, I am confident that the Mamdani team is committed to returning integrity to our government and instilling confidence in the fairness of our contracting process. I look forward to working with the new administration and Director Yu to address past abuses of emergency contracting powers and ensure we have laws and systems in place to prevent future corruption. Before we begin, I just want to recognize the Contracts Committee staff for their tremendous work preparing for this hearing on short notice. I've been really impressed by the team so far. Senior Counsel Alex Polinoff, who has deep experience on the committee, Policy Analyst Alex Yablon, Financial Analyst Spencer Kuhn, and we somehow got our old Committee Counsel from GovOps, Johari Frazier, to follow us to contracts, which is a coup for this committee. Lastly, I just want to thank my Chief of Staff, Molly Haley, who is the most brilliant person I know, and I am very, very, very lucky to have her as my partner in this work. Councilmember Wan is not able to be with us today, but we really appreciate her leadership. I'll now turn it over to the Committee Counsel to administer the oath.
Good morning. Alex Polinoff, Senior Counsel. Will all members of the administration testifying today please raise your right hands? Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in your testimony today, and to respond honestly to council member questions? You may begin when ready. Thanks.
Speaker Menon, Contracts Chair Ressler, Councilmember Brewer, and Councilmember Hanks. Welcome. Well, thank you for having me. I want to start by saying I have prepared my remarks in my testimony based upon the agenda that was given on the short notice. So I do recognize that at the introductory remarks gave mention to the short notice of this hearing. I also want to mention that my remarks and content will be forward-looking, but I do really welcome the council's interest in procurement contracts and invoice accountability. And I hope that this partnership can be a fruitful one and one that we can continue meaningfully in the months and years ahead as part of Mamdani's new administration, as he calls a new era. So with that, I'll turn over to my prepared testimony. So good afternoon, Speaker Menon, Contracts Chair Ressler, and members of the Contracts Committee. My name is Kim Yu, and I'm the Director of the Mayor's Office of Contract Services, what we like to call MOCS. And I'm also the city's Chief Procurement Officer. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today and on the three bills related to procurement transparency, emergency contracting, and subcontractor reporting. MOCS serves as the city's central procurement agency and oversees a procurement system that supports over $42 billion in annual contracting activity across 41 mayoral agencies. Our mission is to ensure that city procurement is fair, transparent, efficient, and aligned with the administration's priorities and accountability, vendor equity, and the timely delivery of essential services for New Yorkers. At MOCS, our top priority remains strengthening the city's role as a reliable, responsive partner, particularly to the nonprofit providers that deliver essential services and anchor the well-being of our communities. In that spirit, MOCS has made it a priority to work closely with Council on the discretionary funding process, including the discretionary grant pilot. The discretionary grant pilot offers a new way of engaging with small community-based organizations to ensure that they are able to quickly receive funding that enables the work they are already doing to support New Yorkers. As the city's central procurement agency, MOCS is committed to partnering with Council and our pilot agency partners to implement and responsibly expand the pilot to support streamlined workflows for both providers and agencies, resulting in faster, more reliable payments to awardees. Over the last several years, MOX has made significant progress in modernizing the city's procurement infrastructure and strengthening procurement governance across agencies. We've continued to expand Passport as the city's end-to-end procurement platform, enabling agencies to manage solicitations, evaluations, awards, contracts, amendments, and vendor performance in a single system. We've also launched Passport Public to provide greater public visibility into procurement activity, and we continue to improve data quality, reporting functionality, and system integration with partner agencies. In parallel, MOX has worked closely with agencies to improve procurement planning, reduce contract backlogs, and strengthen vendor engagement. Through tools like agency procurement plans, targeted technical assistance, and centralized oversight of high-risk procurements, we have helped agencies move more efficiently from solicitation to award and registration, while maintaining appropriate fiscal and legal controls. With respect to emergency contracting, MOX coordinates with agencies and relevant oversight partners as appropriate to support timely procurement while maintaining required controls. Emergency procurement authority is generally used when urgent circumstances require rapid action to avoid disruption to critical operations or essential services to protect life, safety, and property. When agencies seek to use emergency procurement authority, MOX may provide general guidance and support as appropriate and coordinate with other city offices as needed. We have also strengthened internal controls around emergency contracting by standardizing agency guidance, improving documentation protocols, and reinforcing expectations around post-award review and reporting. These measures are intended to promote responsible, transparent, and fiscally sound use of emergency contracting authority. Ensuring strong oversight and accountability in emergency contracting is a shared priority. MOX remains committed to continuous improvement in procurement oversight, transparency, and interagency coordination, particularly in high-risk or time-sensitive contracting contexts. We appreciate Council's continued engagement on procurement reform and welcome the opportunity to share our perspective on the three proposals before the committee today. Intro 0163-2026, Emergency Procurements. This bill would amend the city charter to limit the term of an emergency contract to no more than 30 days, permit renewals only in additional 30-day increments subject to approval by Comptroller and the Law Department, and require emergency contracts to be submitted to the Comptroller for audit within 15 days of execution. MOX recognizes the Council's interest in strengthening oversight and accountability in emergency contracting. Emergency procurements are an extraordinary tool intended to ensure continuity of critical services and rapid response in urgent and unforeseen circumstances. At the same time, we have significant operational concerns about the constraints imposed by the bill. A rigid 30-day cap on emergency contracts, combined with mandatory Comptroller and Law Department approval for each renewal, could substantially hinder agencies' ability to maintain continuity of essential services during extended emergencies. Many emergency conditions, such as prolonged shelter operations, infrastructure stabilization, or public health responses, do not resolve within a 30-day window and require sustained contracted services. Additionally, the proposed 15-day submission deadline for audit may not be feasible in complex emergency scenarios where contract terms are evolving, documentation is still being finalized, or agencies are operating under severe operational strain. MOX looks forward to working towards a balanced path that strengthens reporting, documentation, and post-award oversight of emergency procurements without introducing administrative bottlenecks that could delay urgent service delivery or create legal and operational risk. We welcome the opportunity to work with the Council on alternative approaches that preserve flexibility in true emergencies while enhancing transparency and accountability. Intro 0164 of 2026, Subcontractor Information and False Statements. This bill would require contractors to maintain and report detailed information on subcontractors, It would increase existing criminal penalties and establish new criminal penalties for providing false or misleading information in connection with bidding on city contracts. MOX supports the goal of improving transparency and accountability in subcontracting practices, particularly as it relates to compliance with subcontracting commitments. Ensuring accurate and timely subcontractor reporting is critical to effective oversight enforcement and vendor equity outcomes. Over the last several years, MOX has expanded subcontractor reporting and management functionality within Passport. The platform now supports subcontractor onboarding through Passport account creation, subcontract approval workflows, subcontractor payment validation, and enhanced data collection around subcontracting activity. These tools allow agencies to better monitor subcontractor utilization and help ensure that subcontracting commitments made at award are reflected in actual performance. MOX has also strengthened data governance and compliance protocols related to subcontractor reporting, including validation requirements, documentation standards, and coordination with agency ACOs and program staff. These efforts are designed to improve data accuracy, support enforcement where needed, and reduce administrative burden on vendors, particularly small businesses. We agree with the intent of this bill to deter false or misleading subcontractor reporting and to promote greater transparency in contracting. At the same time, the bill would expand reporting and compliance obligations for both vendors and agencies and would require additional systems development, data validation processes, and enforcement protocols. Moreover, the law department is still reviewing the bill for potential legal issues. As with other procurement reforms, any new subcontractor reporting requirements should be carefully calibrated to align with existing Passport functionality, avoid duplicative reporting, and minimize unintended impacts on small businesses. We welcome continued dialogue with the Council to refine this proposal in a way that strengthens subcontractor transparency and accountability while building on the city's current systems and enforcement frameworks. Intro 0156-2026. Procurement database. This bill would require the city to create and maintain a public-facing procurement interface that aggregates information across the contracting lifecycle, including solicitations, awards, contracts, amendments, expenditures, subcontractors, and related performance data. MOX currently operates the city centralized procurement platform, Passport, which serves as the backbone of the city's contracting system. Passport is the primary tool used by agencies and vendors to manage procurements, from solicitation through registration and post-award contract administration. Since its launch, MOX has expanded Passport through a series of phased releases that introduced end-to-end procurement functionality, integrated vendor management, and post-registration features such as invoicing and payments. In 2024, the city completed the migration of human service contracts from HHS Accelerator into Passport, bringing more than 15,000 contracts and 30,000 budgets into a single system and consolidating human services, goods, and services contracting into one platform. MOX has also built out subcontractor management and payment capabilities, introduced a centralized document repository through Passport Vault, and continues to enhance the system based on regular feedback from agencies and vendors. These efforts are aimed at strengthening usability, consistency, and transparency across the procurement process. To expand access to procurement data for both internal and external stakeholders, MOX recently launched a new set of reporting tools. MOXstat 1.0 is a Power BI application for agency leadership and chief financial officers that provides daily refreshed dashboards on invoice volumes, processing times, aged invoices, budget activity, and advance and recoupment trends. In parallel, MOX has launched a new vendor reporting module in Passport, which gives vendors and agencies access to standardized reports on invoices, contract budgets, advances and recoupments, and solicitation activity, with additional reports under development. To complement these internal and vendor-facing improvements, MOX also operates Passport Public and Passport Navigator, which provides public access to procurement information across multiple stages of the contracting lifecycle. Passport Public offers searchable records, data visualizations, and downloadable data sets that allow the public, vendors, and oversight entities to better understand city procurement activity. MOX supports the objective of improving transparency and accessibility in procurement. At the same time, much of the information contemplated by this bill is already publicly available through Passport Public, Checkbook NYC, and existing agency disclosures, or is being actively delivered through new reporting tools and system enhancements. We welcome continued dialogue with the Council on how best to further strengthen procurement transparency. Any new public-facing interface should be aligned with existing Passport functionality, current data governance standards, and ongoing modernization efforts. It is also important to preserve the flexibility needed for agile software development so that the city can continue to iterate and improve systems without being constrained by inflexible or overly detailed legal requirements. In conclusion, MOX appreciates the Council's focus on procurement transparency, accountability, and vendor equity. We share these goals and remain committed to advancing a procurement system that is fair, efficient, and responsive to the needs of New Yorkers. At the same time, we believe it is essential that any new legislative mandates be grounded in operational realities, aligned with existing systems, and structured to preserve the city's ability to deliver critical services, particularly in emergency contexts. We look forward to continuing to work collaboratively with the Committee on Contracts as these bills move forward and welcome further dialogue. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Director Yu. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues for questions first, but I'll just start with a brief statement. I very much agree with your sentiment that new legislative mandates have to be, quote, grounded in operational realities and aligned with existing systems. I think that we struggled in the previous administration where people would fail to show up at hearings. We wouldn't get no responses from agencies about legislation that we were pursuing. The Legislative Affairs Division was non-existent. And so we couldn't negotiate bills. We couldn't build on existing realities. We just had to put forward the best ideas we could to try to make government work better in a very challenging landscape. And so I'm very hopeful, as this is my first hearing. It's the beginning of a new council. I think today's our first day of hearings. Is that right? Yes. So this is the beginning of a new era for us with a new administration where we really hope and expect to work collaboratively to solve problems together. And so I hope that in advancing this package of legislation, we'll be able to find those compromises and really build off of the existing realities to pass smart bills that advance transparency and accountability and fairness in our contracting system. I think we have a few folks that are interested. Oh, I failed to recognize Brooklyn's own Councilmember Ina Vernikov. Good to have you here on the Contracts Committee. Ina and I served, Councilmember Vernikov and I served together on GovOps, so we're happy to have you. Councilmember Brewer and Majority Whip Hanks would like to ask some questions. We'll start with the Majority Whip and then go to Councilmember Brewer.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you so much for your testimony. In my previous life running a not-for-profit, I know the importance of the MOX system and ensuring payments are timely. But my question is going to be more about the, the subcontractor oversight. Former Comptroller Lander found that only a fraction of emergency contacts had approved subcontractors recorded in the City Pays information portal. One of the bills we're hearing today would require detailed subcontractor information to be maintained in the city's contract database. What systems currently exist for tracking subcontractor information?
Thank you for the question, Councilmember Hanks, and thank you for your previous experience serving nonprofits. Certainly a very vital lived experience that gets brought forward in the work that it certainly adds to the work. So I'm familiar with the controller report that you are referencing. I actually can visualize the bulleted list that the believe Controller Lander also relied upon to draw the data to write the analysis and then produce a set of recommendations upon. I believe he referenced PIP, the Payee Information Portal, HHS Accelerator, which refers to the Health and Human Services Accelerator system that was previously sunset under the prior administration. And then we also have FMS, the city's financial management services, that is overseen by FISA. And then we also, as I testified to, we have Passport.
Thank you so much. Are there safeguards to prevent a prime contractor from being reimbursed prior to paying a subcontractor?
Councilmember, will you flesh out the question a little bit more for me?
So the line of questioning was that we're talking about are like subcontractors currently required to meet the same responsibility standards as prime contractors, and further, like how does the city verify that prime contractors are paying subcontractors appropriately? I mean, I feel like this is a question of accountability and figuring out whether we are keeping track of how contractors, subcontractors are being paid and in which time, and how do we verify that?
Thank you for clarifying. So, Councilmember, I'll start by saying that as we always like to start when it comes to from the city contracting perspective, the city is in the primary contractual relationship with the prime contractor. And then that prime contractor is then in the relationship with the subcontractor. So the city's primary relationship, privity of contract, is with that first relationship, that first vendor. And then there are PPB rules that govern the process of how those subcontractors are identified, submit themselves into the city systems that we just spoke about, and then that enables transparency to see if the payment, well, the approval, the payment, and then the reporting capabilities. I'll also say that while the city has a general process, it would be remiss of me to not mention, because it has been often reported, and it's been reported by Controller Lander, that the DHS portfolio of contracts has a different process, and they have a slightly more rigorous process that they treat their subcontractors. So in that all that explanation, I'm not sure if I got to
We'll get there.
reply.
Well,
Okay, go ahead.
we'll
I'm
get
so sorry.
So I think that that's probably half of the issue. So one of the bills that are being heard today requires prime contractors to provide additional information on contractors prior to the subcontractor approval. Would this information better help agencies understand the subcontractors they have to approve and more easily track the subcontractor performance?
So in general, we support the spirit of the bill and the overall goals of expanding reporting and compliance obligations for both the vendors and the agencies. However, we would just like to further have more conversations as we develop the systems to enable the legislation.
Sorry, that's fair, and we look forward to working with you to do that. Thank you so much for answering my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
No, I was going to just turn it to you.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman. We joke. We weren't going to get into jokes right now.
Mostly joke.
Yeah, mostly jokes. So anyway, thank you for your testimony. I guess I was borough president during COVID, and I was around for DocGo. And I have to say, under COVID, I mean, I personally was helping EDC find masks. I was calling Nevada. I was calling North Dakota. Couldn't find a mask. So, but that should not hopefully happen again. We should be planning for another emergency. And then along came the migrants, which I wish there were more of them, but that's another whole story. The issue there, though, was .go. We had hearings. They're horrible. The food was lousy. The security was lousy. Everything about them was lousy. And of course, I said that into the microphone every day. So my question is, given this COVID experience, asylum experience, and there were other, I'm sure, emergency contracts, I have to say COVID's made a little bit more sense to me because we didn't have any of the tools needed to save people's lives, literally. I could go on the list. Whereas with the migrants, we had the tools, we didn't have enough. It wasn't like we hadn't had people who were homeless before. But I don't understand, in this new administration, how is it going to be different? Because this .go, they still have other contracts that I don't think they should even have now. But how is it that that contract went on for a long time, and how will it be different? Obviously, if this bill passes, it will be very different. But in your eyes, how could it be different in terms of emergency procurement into the future? Some god-awful emergency is going to show up. And so what are we doing to prepare for that, whether it's 30 days, 60 days, and also not these contracts that go on forever that aren't even relevant to the context with which they're supposed to be taking care of the problem. So that .go was a bad situation. So how does it look for the future from your perspective? How can we change it?
Councilmember, thank you so much. And thank you, as I mentioned during Councilmember Hanks, thank you for bringing forward your past experience into the
I could go
conversation.
on.
Sure, please.
Go ahead.
All right. So, Councilmember, as you mentioned, the city's ability to step up and lead and provide the services that New Yorkers need during a time of emergency is, my apologies, is really the heart of the matter at MOX. The procurement tools, the toolbox, emergency contract is one of those tools. The other tools are citywide contracts, master contracts, the expansion of P card usage, things that were brought forward not just in times of the asylum seekers or the pandemic. I'm thinking back to Hurricane Sandy, even the emergency of 9/11. So preserving those sets of tools and using those tools very well is something that requires city leadership accountability. And I really look forward, as I mentioned, to working with this council to having more conversations about lessons learned and proactive steps in the future.
But do you have any suggestions about how, or maybe you looked at other cities or other states as to how they deal with emergency contracts? Because I agree with the speaker that it shouldn't go on forever. It did with .go. Maybe we have to do some preliminary work so that we think about the hurricane or the storm or whatever, and we're ready to have a correct application for the contract. I don't know, but it's not work. It didn't work. So the question is, what are we thinking about in the future for emergency procurement? With all due respect, you didn't really answer the question.
Well, Councilmember, let me give it another try.
Okay.
All right. So, Councilmember, I want to not have policy conversations based on outliers.
Okay.
Right? And I also want to separate out the emergencies that I just listed off and referenced. Those are citywide emergencies. For the most part, emergency contracts, when we look at the data and we look at it fiscal year over fiscal year, the main use of the emergency contract is when we have a destabilized building, for instance. And Department of Building goes in, they do their inspection, and they say, this is not a safe building any longer. HPD, we've got to declare an emergency, and we've got to let out emergency contract.
Vacate order and do a demolition. Right.
Exactly, right. You are all familiar.
We do it all the time.
Yes. And the length of those contracts, as you can imagine, are more than 30 days because it takes time to come in, to inspect, to see what's required to stabilize, to have them stabilize, and then sign off that the building is ready to be turned back over.
Okay, so you're saying that, all right, I mean, I guess what I'm saying a little bit differently, in that case, I assume there could be a fast decision by the controller and anybody else to say more time is needed to take care of the inspection and the demolition and so on and so forth. I mean, that does seem possible. I am more concerned, as you suggest, with some of these larger crises. A building I understand, but I mean, .go went on forever. And why? Do you have any, I don't know if you were around during that horror.
I have to admit that that's something that I would have to take back and come
Okay,
back around.
well, tell them it was horrible and they should get rid of them completely. All right, I'm just saying, I don't think yet, but we can keep working on the emergency contracts, have a way that, God forbid, something else like a hurricane and, happens in the city, and that would be a problem. The other question would be the penalties that do exist. The speaker felt that they have basically cost of doing business. Do you feel the same way, or do you think that those current for those that are providing infractions for whatever reason, that they are sufficient, or do you think they should be higher in terms of penalties?
Councilmember, would you indulge me? What penalties are you referring to?
The speaker was talking about penalties for contractors and subcontractors that, break the rules. In other words, they're supposed to get fined.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that's a sufficient amount of money, or do you think it's okay what the current status is?
I would welcome a further conversation to understand more what she was referring to before I would reply to that.
Okay. And then there's some audit by KPMG about emergency spending. Do you know when it'll be completed? Do you know about it? What's going to happen with that material?
I can't say that I know about that. I would love to see it when it's finalized.
So it does exist? Is there an audit, or you don't know?
I don't know.
Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you very much, Councilmember Brewer. We'll pass it over to Councilmember Vernikoff, and then I will dig in.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for testifying here today. Just a few questions. Regarding the breakdown of the overall $42 billion, can you talk a little bit about how much of that is related to emergency contracts, if you know?
I certainly don't know readily, but I can circle back to you on that.
Okay, yeah, that would be great. And then, do you know about subcontractors? Same question, just subcontractors.
So generally speaking, that $42 billion is for the prime contractors.
Okay.
Yes.
And then, can you talk a little bit about how the passage of these bills would improve fiscal discipline of the city, if you believe they would?
Thank you, Councilmember, for the question. So I'll go through them one at a time, if that's okay, and I can give you my high-level feedback on it, and then happy to dig in further.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'll just start at the top. So 016, to amend the administrative code to mandate a public procurement interface. We have seen prior versions of this bill. They've been introduced since 2016, most recently in 2024. So overall, as I mentioned in the testimony, much of this information is already readily available on public-facing databases, such as Passport, Passport Public, Passport Navigator, the Comptroller's Checkbook, and so any new legislatively required publicly facing interface should be aligned with those existing systems. From a functionality perspective, from a data governance perspective, and just to keep in line with what's modern. So that's the first of the three. And then the second speaker's bill on emergency contracting, limiting emergency contracts to 30 days, requiring comptroller and law department approval for any 30-day renewal. We have not seen this previously introduced, and as I mentioned in the testimony, I appreciate, Mox appreciates, the administration appreciates very much the council's interest in this piece of legislation, but we do have some significant concerns about the constraints that it would impose to the emergency contracting process.
I'm sorry, can you just expound on the concerns, if you don't mind?
As I was mentioning when I was doing the question and answer with Councilmember Brewer, the main usage of the emergency contract tool is when the city is encountering a situation with a compromised building. The building is safe, it's not safe for people to walk in, to stay in there, and so the city Department of Buildings will make the decision that they've got to secure the location, and they'll say that it has to come down. There has to be a demolition. Those situations require more than 30 days. So if we were to put this time constraint on that type of situation, that would be It would just add process, add time. It would also add a law department review and approval, their time and efforts, their cost, the controller's review time, the controller needing to expend resources to achieve the emergency contracting method.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Okay. Do you want me to round out and finish the
Yes,
the
please.
Sure.
Please.
Okay. And then the third of the three bills that are the subject of today's hearing, increased penalties for false statements by contractors, adding penalties in relation to information provided for subcontractor approval. It was previously introduced, but this is the first time we're having a hearing on it. So MOC supports the overall goal, but we have some concerns about the expanded reporting and compliance obligations for vendors and agencies that may require further system development.
Understood. It sounds like we need to work together to make it
I
good
look
for
forward to
everyone.
that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Likewise.
Great. Thank you very much to my colleagues for their thoughtful questions. And we have prepared a healthy number of questions today, so we'll see how time elapses. But, as we've discussed at some length, we've just seen this extraordinary increase in emergency contracting from COVID to the asylum seeker crisis. And while emergency contracting is, of course, a necessary mechanism, Mayor Adams issued an executive order every 5 days for 4 years without any attempt to come up with a new long-term plan. Emergencies shouldn't last for 4 years. Indeed, they're no longer emergencies at that point. But this resulted in 763 emergency contracts totaling $5.9 billion during the course of the Adams administration. And I appreciate very much that Mayor Mamdani has ordered agencies to develop a phase-out plan over the course of less than next month. And just in light of these recent kind of long-term, quote-unquote, I'm going to do the air quotes on emergencies, has MOX conducted any review of how our emergency contracting processes can be improved?
For this calendar year, no.
For this calendar, well, we've seen a phenomenal increase in emergency contracts over the last number of years. I'm not asking if you've conducted a review in the last 2 weeks. I'm asking if you've looked back at the increase in emergency contracts being as significant as they are. Have you conducted any review? And I think Councilmember Brewer was getting at the same point for how emergency contracting process can be improved.
MOX has not, but we would welcome your partnership in doing something like that.
Okay. Do you want to offer any policy suggestions today for us to consider for how we can try to improve our emergency contracting process and perhaps reduce our dependence on these contracts?
I'm happy to have some further conversations offline, not during a hearing.
In fiscal year 2025, previous fiscal year, the city processed more emergency contract modifications than in any other period of the Adams administration. 1,325 modifications, according to a controller report. When the city issues emergency contracts, is there a system in place to flag if this is going to be longer-term work that should be transitioned to a new contract under alternative sourcing or procurement models? How does MOX facilitate or track the transition of emergency contracts?
I'm going to take a step back and just sort of explain that the emergency contracting tool, as we all agree, is a tool that is to be used judiciously.
But it hasn't been, right? It
Well,
should be. I mean,
it should
I think
be.
what you're saying is
Yes,
it should be.
yes,
It hasn't been.
Yes.
That's why we're having the hearing.
Well, I'm happy to have that kind of a hearing at a different time and just sort of, as I mentioned at the top during the preamble, I was really focused on the content of the proposed legislation. But I'm happy
Right,
to
but
engage.
isn't that the substance of the legislation?
Not so much.
Okay. That was my read, certainly on Councilmember Menon's legislation, but go ahead, as you were saying.
I'm happy to sort of take all these back and have a further follow-up conversation. I would welcome it, truly.
Okay. When there's a mod on an emergency contract, as there were 1,325 mods on emergency contracts last fiscal year, does Mox review that mod?
No, we do not.
Should
Under
it?
the charter, under the PPB rules, we do not.
Should it?
I will say that is the agencies who are first on the line in working through the situation that is calling for the need for an emergency contract. And certainly Mox as an advisory role, we are here, we are available, but legally we do not have a formal role in that.
Right, but should Mox have a role in reviewing the 1,325 mods that happened on emergency contracts last fiscal year?
I would welcome a conversation about it. I would say that the emergency contracting laws and rules that are in place in the charter, in the PPB rules, and even in the state general municipal law, they've withstood the test of time and they're battle tested. And there's a certain amount of rigor that is applied when emergency contracts go through the process that's outlined in the law.
Right.
They go through the comptroller review and approval, they go through the law department approval and review, and then the comptroller ultimately registers those contracts.
Right. I hear you. I would certainly say if we were talking about, we wouldn't be having this hearing today on these topics if the preponderance of emergency procurements, the emergency contracts, were around demolitions, right? The reason we're having this hearing is because the Adams administration spent nearly $6 billion through emergency procurements for years on end without any competitive process, without any without meaningful, thoughtful oversight, except for controller review. And even when the controller rejected contracts or refused to comply, the Adams administration went right ahead anyway, which may or may not be legal. So, if there isn't a formal review of the mods that are happening on emergency contracts, are you tracking these these modifications on emergency contracts? Like, is Mox aware of what's happening on emergency contracts? Like, how do you help me understand how you see your role in this, even if there isn't a crisp charter mandate that Mox is approving it?
So, Councilmember, just to sort of respond to the first part, in the reference to the contracts that have been mentioned throughout the hearing by the speaker, by Councilmember Brewer, by yourself, as I bucketed, those are outliers, and there were also contracts that were entered into, and I'm not excusing, these were contracts that were entered into in extraordinary times, the asylum seeker crisis. And they were also entered into and had the blessings of those who were in the highest levels of government. Mayor Adams, Comptroller Lander, Corporation Counsel. And if there is truly a desire to look into those contracts, and I am very eager to understand what Councilmember Brewer referenced as the KPMG audit in that report. Let's dig into that and let's do that. Not like during the form of a hearing. That was noticed on very short notice, as Councilmember Ressler you mentioned at the top. Having said that, Mox does receive as an informed oversight, as it does on many contracts, notice of emergency contracts when they're first entered into, and then also amendments on emergency contracts. And also in our relationships with the agencies and their overall performance on procurements and how they're planning their contracts, we maintain those steady weekly check-ins and engagements and ask them how they're doing on all their contracts, emergency contracts included.
Okay, so so you are notified, you are aware, you do check in with agencies on it. Do you work with those agencies to then transition those emergency contracts to standard procurements?
Yes.
Is there a record or progress to show over these past 4 years of having done that successfully? Just considering, again, the phenomenal scale of emergency procurements that we saw from COVID to the asylum seeker crisis.
It's something that we can certainly circle back on.
Okay. That would be helpful, because if that is occurring, it would be good to know. I didn't have any indication of that in advance of this hearing. And just for awareness, are you able to share with us, like, how many emergency contracts relating to the asylum seeker crisis are still active?
I certainly have some data prepared, council member, but to be very precise about the data, I'd want to circle back.
Okay, we will definitely seek that information in writing. My understanding is that in addition to the mega site in the South Bronx on Bruckner, there's still approximately 150 migrant hotels that are operating, housing approximately 30,000 individuals. That was at least as of November, significantly down from the peak, but still a healthy number of people. Is there a I'll wait for the Mamdani plan later this month or next month for how we're transitioning some of these contracts. I wanted to ask about 30-day duration, and then I'm going to pass it to. Let me just finish on this bill, and then I'll pass it to Councilmember Gennaro, and then I'll come back on the other bills. So, 30-day duration. Proposed legislation on emergency contract duration would limit emergency contracts to 30-day terms with renewals requiring the approval from both the controller and Corp Counsel. Could you share any insight on, like, a typical term of an emergency contract, a range? Do you maintain the data on emergency contracts for kind of what is a standard length? It totally varies case by case. Any insight you can share just so we have a sense as a council of how 30 days compares and contrasts?
We certainly have metrics, and now that I have some insight into your thinking and what the question is, I'm happy to take that back. I don't want to provide data that I have that it might not be directly responsive to what you're asking, council member.
Okay. And what's the typical time frame currently required to process an emergency contract? Is that something that and to process a renewal, just to understand that 15-day time frame?
What would you count as process?
Well,
And that may help. And if you don't know, we can certainly.
I mean, I think it's
yeah.
from the time that I guess you would consider when it appears in FMS as the conclusion. So the start point, I imagine, is when law department and the controller's office begin their review, or you tell me, what's the right start point on it?
So maybe if I could do a little bit of storytelling about the process of emergency contract. And let me use, let's say, the most frequent, the DOB example of an unsafe building that DOB has declared in need of an emergency declaration. And then they will refer that over to their sister agency, HPD. The first step would be seeking that there is an emergency situation, and the law department and the controller's office have to agree and approve that such a circumstance exists. And under the PPB, I don't know if I'll quote it exactly, but the emergency condition exists if there is a threat to life, safety, person, or property. And so you can imagine using that standard, the law department and the controller's office, depending on the severity of the emergency or the exigency of the circumstances, they may turn around, yes, that is an emergency situation within minutes. Or they may say that this needs a little bit more time and deliberation, and the prior approval, as it's called in the law, is not given in the minutes, but maybe it's given in a few days, maybe a week. And it would really depend upon the emergency. So after an agency is able to obtain prior approval by both the law department and the controller's office, the agency effectively has the go-ahead to do an emergency procurement, which means that they can do a streamlined procurement process. They can do something as simply picking up the phone and calling a vendor that they know is competent, qualified, and will be responsible to receive that city contract. And because of the emergency powers that exist in the law, that vendor, once it's selected by the agency, has the go-ahead to do that work and effectively has an emergency contract with the City of New York, despite the fact that it has not been registered by the Comptroller's Office and does not show up in FMS. So, but the reality is, for an emergency contract to be paid, it does have to show up in FMS, as you mentioned, Council Member. And so the time that it will take for the documentation to be produced and for it to get to the Comptroller's Office for review and registration will really vary on the circumstances. And I'm happy to flush out what some of the examples are and the metrics are that roll up into that very general process I just described.
Okay. What I'm trying to get at is a 30-day renewal. If we're looking at if we're looking at metrics for how long it's taking to get a contract in place, an emergency procurement in place in the first place, how does that inform a 30-day contract? How long is a renewal taking on average now? How does that inform the renewal timeframes here? You know, beyond, separate and apart from the demolition vendors or a kind of localized incident, for citywide emergencies, do you think that a 30-day renewal time frame will impact the city's ability to attract appropriate vendors?
I do.
Could you elaborate or give specific examples?
Well, I know that there's a shying away from using the one that I keep bringing up, the Department of Building one and the HPD one, but for a general contractor who has requirements such as insurance and bonding, if they know that they are going to have to do not just a process with the city for a city contract generally, and that it has to be re-upped or reapproved, potentially renegotiated every 30 days, that does not provide them a lot of assurance or stability that they're really looking for when they're entering into a contract, it's particularly an emergency contract.
As you look back at the migrant crisis and think about large emergency procurements that the city pursued, can you think of examples in that instance where it may have been challenging to identify vendors that would have agreed to terms of a 30-day contract?
I want to be very consistent with how I started. I'm not going to speak about those asylum seeker contracts that were under the prior administration because, quite frankly, I don't know.
Okay, fair. What would happen if the controller did not approve a 30-day renewal? Structurally, the mayor and the controller often have a combative relationship. I think almost always have a combative relationship. Councilmember Brewer can disagree, or she can come up with a counterexample for me. But you know, it's a reasonable enough scenario to anticipate. Would the mayor's office be able to deem an emergency contract if the controller failed to cooperate, or just plow ahead as they did with DocGo? Like, are there legal risks to such an approach? Like, I'm just trying to understand what are the dynamics here if a controller is uncooperative.
That is something that I would certainly want to confer with the law department about and defer to them as well, and give them the opportunity to opine on something like that, on that type of a scenario.
Any insights that you can share with us today, or any thoughts?
I would just really be mindful that the city of New York and the governance, the respective elected officials have certain powers and responsibilities, and any sort of stepping in others' toes or in other people's lanes are, structurally, if it's potentially asking for conflicts to arise. So I would just, be mindful of.
You worked in the controller's office, right?
I did.
Okay, so you've been on both sides of this. I mean, I raise it because for a standard contract, if the controller's office is uncooperative, the administration can just deem it and move right ahead, and it doesn't really matter, as far as I understand. You can please feel to correct me as the expert. But in emergency procurement, the controller's office is actually required to sign off. There's a different level of approval that is expected. Is that, am I right in breaking that down? Am I breaking that down correctly? So there's just a different level of power and responsibility and authority that's being given to the controller's office with an ongoing renewal mechanism on emergency contracts, which could inform how confident vendors feel in the in a contract that has a 30-day renewal notice, right?
Certainly, council member. Additional, was it cooks in the kitchen, right?
So, and just wondering, have you reviewed this proposed legislation with the law department?
I have not. Certainly, they are reviewing it.
Because they're the lead agency on emergency procurements. Just, I mean, right? As you've said, Mox is not, the law department is from the mayoral side. Do you have any, you have not discussed it with them? Okay. And then just one more question on this, and then I'm going to pass it to Councilmember Gennaro. 15-day registration. The bill would require agencies to submit contracts to the Controller's Office within 15 days. A 2023 report by the Controller's Office found that only 43 of 292 emergency contracts were submitted within 30 days. So again, that's, I don't know, less than 15%. Could you please explain why an agency might not be able to submit a contract within this period? You have the contract exists, right? Why is it so hard for agencies to then submit the contract to the Controller's Office? Is it a staff capacity issue? Is it hard for vendors to send the needed info? Is there staffing up in an emergency? Like, what's the challenge there?
I believe there are a myriad number of challenges potentially, and I think some of those you listed are some of them. But I'm happy to dig into that further and come back in our further conversations.
Councilmember Gennaro, did you want to jump in? Another former member from GovOps that we're happy to have follow us to contracts.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Director. I got here late. I was at another hearing, and I just have, it's more of an observation than a question. On a couple of instances since I've been here, there were questions that you couldn't answer because you did not have the data in front of you. We get that. But on 4 or 5 times, and you know, the chairman, you know, this is a new, you know, a new committee chairmanship. He needs a good relationship with you. He wants to cultivate one. I don't really care, you know, so he cares, I don't. And so on, yeah, it's a nice thing, but you know, the way to be nice to the council is a couple of times you said, I'd rather talk about this offline. I'd rather, you know, not say it here, not you know, rather not do it here. Like you have an answer, but you don't want to say it. But that's not how this works. I don't want to usurp the authority of the chair, but you know, if you have the answer, you're supposed to say it. And just responding that you'd rather not do it here on the record, you know, in front of the people here, in front of the people who are watching on the live stream, in front of people who may see it at some later date. Again, you know, like the you know, chairman's a very nice fellow, but you know, it's like when I come to a hearing and somebody has an answer, I expect them to sort of come out with it, and the chips fall where they may. I know this was put together in a short time, and I get all that, but you know, to me, it's like unseemly and non-cooperative to someone whose reply is, I don't really want to talk about it here in front of a bunch of people. We should get together and caucus behind closed doors and figure something out. That just doesn't work for me. And I don't think that should be the paradigm for you or any witness that comes before this committee. Not that it's really my thing to say. And I'll just say also that it is, you know, customary protocol in the council. You keep calling him Councilmember Wrestler. I believe his title is Chairman Wrestler or Mr. Chairman. So I just wanted to put that on the record and, you know, be a pain in the neck. So there you have it. You could respond or not respond, but please don't say, let's talk about it offline, because that is an inappropriate response. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think the year was 1999 when Councilmember Gennaro was first elected to the city council. Is that right?
2001, when dinosaurs roamed the earth.
2001, excuse me. I knew it was a special. I didn't realize it was in '01. But we're grateful for.
All under the specials.
You were elected in a.
We all came in 2001.
Right. Oh, but I thought you came in a special before.
Two. You came in before one.
I came in a special
And we all came in two.
in round 2.
Got it. So you're right. Councilmember Brewer came in '02. So we appreciate your long history and strong advocacy for the institution. I did want to ask about differing pay rates off the same contracts. I've asked about this in a couple different times at GovOps hearings, at DCAS, at Mayor's Office of Operations, and others over the past few years. But this security guard example just really upset me for how we could have the same existing backdrop contract and have different agencies pay such radically different sums off of that contract for the same exact service. Not to mention the fact that there was a DHS contract with a vendor providing the same service for yet a fraction of that price. Basically, Health and Hospitals paid $117 per hour for security guards. NISM paid $79 per hour for security guards off the same contract. DHS had a contract with a unionized security guard operation for $24 an hour, $24 per hour. This is, this could save taxpayers millions of dollars per month for security guards. So help me understand what went wrong there, what should have happened, who didn't provide the oversight that was needed in the negotiation of that contract to deliver the best price for the city.
Thank you for the question, Chairman Ressler. And my apologies if I addressed you in a manner that offended you. It was not my intention.
No,
and it's not my practice to let things gloss over. And I appreciate you and Councilmember Brewer, but I also don't want to miss my opportunity to address Councilmember Gennaro. Thank you for your years of service as a public servant, and thank you for your thoughts on the appropriate behavior and decorum for this hearing. I'll say that I have appeared, I have prepared, I have testified, I have answered questions, and it is my intent to have a professional, cordial, collegial relationship with this council, and it is in all of our interests in the city of New York to do our best. And so thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you, and I stand by my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. They are received. Chairman Ressler, I want to pivot back to your question. So thank you for it. I appreciate it very much. And I will share that we did do some preliminary digging into this, but I do want to be as robust and thoughtful in reply to this inquiry of yours. So I can commit to talking to DHS and DSS and coming back to you on this because I know it is of interest to you, Chairman.
I appreciate it. I think one of the best ways for us to reduce our reliance on emergency contracts is to have good backdrop contracts available. Like I presume this DCAS security guard contract was a backdrop contract that they had that people could buy off, that agencies could buy off of to easily step up in an emergency to bring security guards in to help with a new shelter or whatever it may be. And then, but the lack of, so it should be a good alternative, but then what are the oversight mechanisms that we should have in place off of these backdrop contracts that DCAS, I would assume, primarily holds, but other agencies could hold that for sister agencies and brother agencies to benefit from? Like, how do we ensure the right oversight so that the city's always getting the best price for something that's been competitively bid and is intended to be in place to make it easy for agencies to take advantage of city services or of city vendors? I'm very keen on this KPMG audit that they've been doing at DOI's behest around asylum seeker spending. Have they been in contact with you about this? Do you have any sense of their timing?
I read about this KPMG report for the first time, that city article with the outgoing DOI commissioner and Councilmember Brewer. I believe that that is what you were referring to. That's the extent of my knowledge. I look forward to reading it as well.
Okay, cool. Me too. One of the bills we're hearing today would increase penalties for false statements in subcontracting tenfold, since the current penalties have not been updated in decades. Are you aware of, like, does Mox track false statements in subcontracting? Is there a sense of scale of this issue that you might be able to provide insight on?
I'm not at this time, but it's something that I can certainly commit to coming back to you on.
My sense is that one of the challenges with this legislation is that, amazingly, many of our agencies still rely on paper-based subcontracting. Could you elaborate on the technological challenges in implementing the subcontracting transparency legislation? Can you break down what agency processes are still paper-based? Is Mox working with city agencies to end paper-based processes in the year 2026? I certainly hope so. We actually have well, I will stop on my legislation. But yeah, could you provide some insight here on just how hard it is to move off of a paper-based system?
Oh boy, what a question. As you can imagine, moving from a paper-based system to a digital system is challenging. And it requires a lot of what folks like to say change management, right? It requires really understanding your audience. In this case, the context is subcontractors. So you've got to get their attention, their willingness, and you've got to incentivize them to submit themselves into a system on top of all the other things that they are already doing. And that is first and foremost likely running their business. But the incentive is payment, right? And their submission to the city system will allow them to receive their payment for their subcontractor work. You know, it was not so long ago that the city of New York had a paper-based procurement system. And we are now fully digital, but the subcontractor component is, as I mentioned at some other portions of my testimony, more challenging on another layer because it is our primary relationship with the prime contractors. So we've got to often manage our subcontractor relationships through those prime vendor contracts. So it is a process, and it is.
Do you know if there are agencies that have a fully online subcontracting system?
Well,
System for tracking all subcontractors?
all the agencies are using Passport, and within Passport, there's a subcontractor module, and that is in addition to the system that the controller and the mayor oversee, PIP. I would say that subcontractor module, if my memory serves me right, was turned on last calendar year. So it is fairly new in the grand scheme of city contracting. Okay. And while it is, we certainly see a lot of activity there, there's more work to be done.
But in the not distant future, all subcontracting should be properly tracked in PIP.
Passport.
In Passport, but the city's pay information portal, PIP, should have all subcontracting information recorded.
Well, PIP would just be, and this is a little bit outside my expertise, but it is just really their accounting information for the purposes of payment.
Okay. So is it the idea that we'd be tracking all of this information for subcontractors feels very straightforward? Are the technological challenges in implementing the bill, you think the greatest obstacle?
I believe there are some operational challenges. There are some legal concerns about the criminal penalties that I would have to defer to the law department on. So those are some of the
Penalties aside, the
considerations.
transparency piece.
I believe we're in line.
Okay. And I think I asked about kind of your awareness of false statements by subcontractors recently. Are you aware of large fines, or do you think that the fine amounts being as modest as they are an ineffectual deterrent?
I honestly would have to dig into that a little bit more to offer you a meaningful opinion.
I would like to ask about the searchable database. So, forgive me, I'm new to this committee. So, could you just explain on the record the differences between Checkbook NYC, Passport Public, and Passport Navigator?
I cannot explain. Well, I've previously used Checkbook. I don't use Checkbook in my regular, day to day.
Right. But just the value or the functionality of each. Could
Sure.
you compare
So
them?
sure. So the three of them, my understanding, all transparency tools, all public facing. Checkbook, one in my history lessons will serve me well, I hope. Stood up under Comptroller Liu, and really was to provide some transparency into the money that was going out, kind of like a checkbook, like a ledger, right? Passport Public provides more transparency as it relates to the procurements and the solicitations. So if I, as a nonprofit, Kim Yu, would like to provide childcare services to the city of New York, I can go to Passport Public and see who has some opportunities on the horizon, such as ACS, maybe DYCD, and I can learn of those solicitations and I can prepare myself to compete for those opportunities. Passport Navigator is similar, that it provides more, not so much of a public, but more of an internal, some more internal opportunities for procurements and contracts.
And so if we were to pass some version of Councilmember Wan's legislation, do you think the optimal model would be to kind of integrate it into Passport Public? Is that the right kind of existing tool that's closest to what she has envisioned?
It is possible. I do want to say that there are maybe some devil in the details, some things around the margins that the law is looking for that may not be readily available and may not be appropriate for public consumption.
Could you give examples of what kind of stuff?
I want to say maybe a vendor's address.
Okay. But with some concerns around privacy to be discussed further, the general gist of what Councilmember Wan is trying to achieve is through updates to Passport Public. And my understanding, I guess the fiscal impact statement is ours. So, but it was estimated as $400,000 a year or something to do this. It's not this is not a heavy technological lift. These are relatively modest modifications to Passport Public to achieve the vision of what she's outlined.
I would have to dig into that fiscal impact statement again, in contrast
that's fair.
to,
I'm not asking
yes.
you to defend that. That's ours. It's not OMB's, right? We haven't gotten OMB's yet. So OMB may have a different opinion. They always do. But I'm sure it'll be less money, don't you think? But OMB submitted one last year. Excuse me. Oh, thank you very much, Molly. So OMB submitted one last year. They estimated it $400,000. That's where that number came from. So we have the same figure. So sorry, this is not the first time this bill was heard. So they estimated it $400,000 a year, which I'm sure they developed in consultation with your office. That's a pretty small amount of money for a technology project, which I interpret to mean we're talking about relatively modest modifications to an existing tool to be able to comply with the spirit of her legislation. Mm-hmm. Is that basically right?
I would want to look at it again, and referred to the technologists and also the budget folks, who are provide much more expertise in understanding the cost and the technical requirements.
And just to share it on the record so that we have it, in last year's fiscal impact statement from OMB, quote, "It is anticipated that MOX would require $398,000 to hire 2 additional developers to expand passport capabilities. MOX also anticipates incurring potential expenses associated with contracting a consultant to expand platform usability." So what's described, at least by OMB, is a relatively modest lift over just a 2-year period to be able to facilitate compliance with this, to, I think, to make Passport Public an even better tool for New Yorkers to understand what's happening in procurement processes citywide. I just want to check with colleagues. Do you guys have additional? Councilmember Brewer does have an additional
Just
question.
very quickly, just so I understand, because you're fixed on some things, I am fixed on .go. So when there were, perhaps just in the press, because you were not maybe able to see the amendments or the mods and so on, but when you see in the press the bad food, the security issues and so on, what happens? What happens? I mean, that was an emergency contract. Would that be something that was stopped by the controller? That's when it was renewed. But all of those things were ongoing. There's no way to do anything about that, right?
So, Councilmember Brewer, if I could, I would want to take a step back and say traditionally what should happen, right?
Okay, that'll be helpful.
Because what you're describing, I want to say, is a situation where a vendor and the city are in a relationship and the vendor is not performing to the expectation of the city.
Right.
Right? And in those scenarios, there are processes that exist, such as a performance evaluation.
Okay.
Right? And that performance evaluation is, as it is in other contexts, a tool for communication to let everybody know that this is not working well, right?
Yep.
And there's room for improvement. So there's that. And then also, because it is a contractual relationship, there's always some, depending on the terms of the contract,
All right.
there are maybe some penalties, right? Sometimes they mean liquidated damages. Sometimes they mean withholding payment. Or sometimes it means breach of contract. We are not going to continue this relationship. And then even outside of that contractual relationship, vendors place a great amount of significance in their relationship with the city as a whole.
Right, because they may want other contracts.
Right, exactly. So, and there are mechanisms in place where that MOX does properly oversee, where we would ask, the agency that was letting that contract to provide documentation that performance on that contract was not satisfactory, and so that other other agencies would know about that.
Got it.
But that's all generally speaking.
That would be for whether emergency or not. Any contract will go through the same process.
Right.
Okay. I guess because there is an emergency, you tend to not necessarily have somebody else to jump in, or that's sort of why there's an emergency. But I do think in that situation, so we don't have it again, maybe we need different processes for emergency contracts. I don't know. But, when a general contract, you can, you're providing the services for the nonprofit, but this is emergency. And so I'm just saying that was so egregious, I guess I have to say, that we just don't want that to happen again. And I think we should be looking at it. There may be other contracts that were similarly challenging, but that one really stuck with me. And so I'm just saying that's what we need to look at. I don't know whether it's this legislation or additional or something else, but that one was high on my list of how in the world did we get to this point? Not only was it expensive, it was lousy service. And that's not fair. So I appreciate the process, but I'm just asking something to consider would be a different process for something that egregious, because it didn't work. Thank you.
I really appreciate those sentiments, Councilmember Brewer, and I agree with them very much. And I think that one of the things that we're trying to get at in the hearing today is that we recognize the importance of emergency procurement. When we've now used the example of the HPD demolition emergency contract, Nobody's trying to make that any. I don't think the intention of this legislation is to make that process any more challenging for city agencies to execute. I think the concern is when we've seen 763 contracts relating to the migrant crisis, emergency contracts relating to the migrant crisis totaling close to $6 billion over the last 4 years, with very limited oversight or accountability and little data to show how those contracts are being transitioned to standard procurements. That's when we have concerns. And as Councilmember Brewer, I think, eloquently articulated, some of those emergency contracts have seen corruption, as frankly we saw far too much corruption across the Adams administration. So there is less oversight, there is less review of an emergency procurement, and we want to make sure that our money is being well spent every single time. I had one other question, and I did just want to share that we did receive testimony from the IBO, which I think was helpful, and appreciated their written testimony. Since they're not here, I'll just note that they have recommended that the mayor and controller should be required to renew their joint decision to use emergency procurement every 2 years after the original registration date. That's another, I think, approach that I think has merit, just to be looking at how do we create some guardrails here around emergency procurements. They also, said that making Passport Public a better tool for the public to provide real transparency on the workings of city procurement has value as well. So it doesn't comment too specifically on Councilmember Wan's bill, but says that is a noble goal. And so I just appreciate the IBO's smart insights on those 2 points. The question I want to ask you is, we often use this data point that over $40 billion in city spending goes to contractors, goes out to vendors. Do you know, of that $40 billion, how much goes to subcontractors?
I do not. It's something that we can dig into. I do not.
Because my guess just would be that it's substantial. That's an informed guess. But it's obviously substantial. Let me state that differently. It's many, 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 many billions of dollars, and there should be tighter. There should be real transparency and accountability for how that money is being spent, and so I'm really hopeful that Councilmember Menin's, or Speaker Menin's, I gotta get used to that still, Speaker Menin's legislation that would ensure that that agencies and their vendors are reporting crisply and clearly on every subcontractor will help us understand how that money's being spent and ensure that some of the shenanigans that we've particularly seen among DHS shelter operators, but that I think we've seen more broadly, could be brought under control. I think that's it for us. We're good. On short notice, once again, thank you for coming in and joining us today. Look forward to working together. We appreciate your time very much. Director Yu, I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon. We are going to transition to public testimony, which I have a document for of things I'm supposed to read, so I'm good. Thank you, Paul. Thank you. Alex. I now open the hearing for public testimony. I remind members of the public I'm going to do this as fast as I can because I just have to do it. I remind members of the public this is a formal government proceeding, that decorum shall be observed at all times. As such, members of the public shall remain silent at all times. The witness table is reserved for people who wish to testify. No video recording or photography is allowed from the witness table. Further, members of the public may not present audio or video recordings as testimony, but may submit transcripts of such recordings to the Sergeant at Arms for inclusion in the hearing record. If you wish to speak at today's hearing, please fill out an appearance card with the Sergeant at Arms and wait to be recognized. When recognized, you will have 3 minutes to speak at today's hearing. If you've written statement or additional written testimony you wish to submit for the record, please provide a copy of the testimony to the Sergeant at Arms. You may also email written testimony at council.nyc.gov within 72 hours of this hearing. Audio and video recordings will not be accepted. I will now call up the first panel, which is Charles Diamond, Paula Magnus from the Northside Center, Alex Camarda from Reinvent Albany, and Ben Weinberg from Citizens Union, who was the #1 most frequent flyer at the GovOps Committee. We welcome him back to Contracts. Thank you. Okay. You all can feel free to testify in whichever order you are so moved.
Thank you, Chair Ressler. Thank you, Councilmember Brewer and Council Polanov. It's lovely to be here for my first time in a personal capacity. As Council Polanov knows, I served as counsel for the Mayor's Office of Contract Services for 3 years. In the Adams administration, I served the Controller's Bureau of Contract Administration for 2 years in the Stringer administration. And both of those crises, the COVID and asylum emergency contracts, were eras that I lived through from different points of view. I'd note, if you remember, Controller Stringer, in fact, sued Mayor de Blasio over that suspension of procurement authority, which I was also involved in. So I have a deep love and understanding of emergency contracting. I thought it would be remiss in my newfound personal capacity if I did not take the opportunity. Chair, you had asked what is the right amount of time. My personal opinion, you said 30 days. I think it needs to be 90, and I'm going to tell you why very briefly. The analysis of, are we going to use an emergency contract, as the nerds would say, a PPB 306, right? The question is going to be, what are my other options? Could I use a negotiated acquisition? Could I use an MWBE small purchase? Can I do an RFP, right? In each of those instances, the truth of city contracting is none of those options takes less than 90 days to start getting in the books. So I would say this, every single emergency will be 30 days plus 2 renewals, which I just think if we're going to take a real hard look at this, I think we can be realistic in looking at it. The second thing I would say is the downside, I think this is very, very real. If we have a system where you're legally only able to have a 30-day contract, take the demolition example, which is real. The problem is that legal lack of certainty will absolutely hurt competition. There are going to be vendors that say, well, it's going to take me 60 days. We're going to say, yeah, I know, but technically I got to go to the controller law department. They're going to go, yeah, my lawyers tell me that means I can't do this. That's a real, I think, hammer, which I think 90 days lessens that, because it is much more realistic for our normal emergencies. Finally, we asked about total emergencies. I would say this, in my personal experience, already, the law department and the controller won't let you do an emergency contract for longer than a year, because that's how long it takes to do the most complicated RFP. So of course you could do no more than a year. But there are a handful of examples where it goes beyond. I can think of 2 COVID contracts that were like 3 or 4 years because of bonding, as Director Yu stated. So I'd also say there are times, and maybe in the future we can use an NA for that instead of an emergency. But so I would say I think there are exceptions where we will need to do a long emergency contract, as weird as that seems. But I think all of these are correct. I think 90 days is the right time. Finally, I would say this. You would also, Chair, as you're correctly dancing around the topic of where is Mox and all of this, let's face it, we have the law department and the controller. If our answer is more of the same approvers, the law department and the controller's office approved ECHO. They approved it twice. Fred Lander approved it twice and then failed to register it, but he approved it twice. And I don't blame them structurally. They have limited roles. The law department is there to approve as to form. They're there to approve as legal sufficiency. They're not really there to say, is this a good deal? And if we are asking them to do that, is that really their day job? And the controller's office, similarly, they have statutory limitations on what they're allowed to do. Are they really the best person to say this is a bad deal? No, they'll do it anyway, as we all know, but it's not necessarily the strongest tool. So I would certainly encourage the idea of ensuring that MOX is statutorily written into any rules regarding emergency contracts. I think that would be appropriate, given my personal experience on both sides of the aisle. I'll stop there. Happy to answer any questions.
That's great testimony. Thank you very much. We really appreciate your expertise. We'll do questions at the end of the panel.
Good afternoon, Chairman Ressler, and members of this committee. My name is Ben Weinberg. I'm the Director of Public Policy at Citizens Union, a nonpartisan good government group. I want to congratulate this committee for its first hearing, and thank you for dedicating it for such an important topic. It comes at a critical moment for New York City government. As was mentioned here, the outgoing mayoral administration left behind a legacy tarnished by corruption scandals, weakened accountability, and eroded public trust. And restoring integrity to City Hall and city government must be a top priority for both the new mayor and this council. And this is why we appreciate Speaker Menin's recognition in a recent interview that the council will look back at what happened over the past few years and strengthen oversight mechanisms. The 3 bills before the council today are an important step forward in that effort. As one mentioned, emergency procurement and subgrant contracting are essential tools. But at the same time, these areas are also riddled with gaps, with insufficient enforcement, creating conditions that invite misuse of public funds, conflicts of interest, and in some cases, actual corruption, as was mentioned here. We thank Speaker Menin, Councilmember Wan for introducing these bills and for advancing reforms that would bring greater scrutiny and clear reporting and stronger oversight. And we look forward to seeing these measures move forward and strengthen where necessary, to meaningfully address the vulnerabilities that have come to light. But I would also like to mention that there is more that the council can do as it reflects on the lesson of the last several years, as the speaker had mentioned. And as it examines the structural weaknesses that demand serious legislative action beyond contracts. One area is conflicts of interest and cronyism in appointments, and that we saw in under the last administration. That's enabled by insufficient ethical safeguards for incoming officials, by opaque guidance from the Conflicts of Interest Board. Another area is the largely unregulated lobbying environment, where we have insiders that evade contribution limits through bundling. We have insider lobbyists that trade campaign consulting for access, or that benefit from lax enforcement by the city clerk's office. Many of these weaknesses have legislative solutions that have been proposed by members of this body, including Councilmember Ressler and Brewer, and we look forward to seeing them advanced. Looking back also means protecting the city's oversight agencies from funding cuts and from erosion of capacity, as well as advancing a mechanism to remove a mayor for serious misconduct. Two proposals that were put forward by the Charter Commission established by this council. We encourage the council to prioritize those proposals. In closing, today's bills represent a meaningful response to real failures that have undermined public trust. We urge the council to continue this work, learning from what went wrong, strengthening oversight, and restoring integrity across city government. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Good afternoon, Chair Ressler, members of the Council Committee on Contracts. My name is Alex Camarda. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for Reinvent Albany. Reinvent Albany is a watchdog organization that advocates for open and accountable government in New York. We support all three bills before the Council today with some recommendations to strengthen them. We also have one new proposal for your consideration that's not in a bill form. As was mentioned by this committee multiple times today, there were ongoing investigations in the Adams administration for the $432 million emergency contract with DocGo, providing temporary housing for asylees, its payments to hotel operators, and several other contracts that came under review as well. We're glad to see the council moving quickly to embrace their oversight role in this first hearing and move legislation to ensure transparency of contracts, a very important issue. Regarding Intro 156, the Councilmember Juan bill on a public procurement interface, as I think the director spoke to, we think that Passport Public is the ideal place to put this information that the bill mandates. The bill leaves it open-ended, providing some flexibility to create public procurement interfaces, suggesting there could be more than one location where this information's put. We think it should be in Passport Public. And we support the legislation, but we have several recommendations to strengthen it. First and foremost, the city charter already requires that contracts be published, and they are not, as far as we can tell. They're scattered across different agencies, but most of them are not published. That's section 1064 of the charter that requires that. And so we think that Passport Public or whatever other public interface ultimately reveals this information in the WAN bill, contracts should be part of that. They should be able to be downloaded, and any information that needs to be redacted, like pricing, could be redacted. We think the city's caution list of vendors should be published and archived. This is a list that we've foiled, and many others have. There have been 89 requests since 2017 to MOX. It's not proactively made available. It includes the debarred entities and those companies that have been found non-responsible by the city. This is something the federal government publishes proactively, and they even include archived lists dating back to 2015, and the city should do it as well. We think any of the information that's put into the portal that's required by the bill should be machine readable and downloadable. That would enable groups like ours to scrutinize the information, sort it by different factors and columns, and provide an additional level of review that will help to ensure the integrity of the contract process. You also heard today that there are many different databases, many different laws that relate to disclosure of contract information. It's really actually hard to wrap your head around all of them. We think that this bill that Councilmember Juan has should specify which areas of law and which portals the Chief Procurement Officer should review before
new information is placed in Passport or another public-facing interface. And some of these have already been mentioned today, certainly Passport, PIP, FISA, the city record, the city agency procurement plans. These are all sources with contract information. Some of them are internal, some of them are public-facing, but they should be reviewed for this information because as the director spoke to, the subcontractor information is certainly available in internal databases before the city, and that information should be coordinated and integrated so that it can be in this public-facing database. And ultimately, we think a beta test should be done of the new database so that stakeholders like reInvent Albany and other groups and even contractors can see it and give recommendations related to it before it's finalized. Regarding the speaker's bill, specifically Intro 163, that requires joint approval of extension of emergency contracts. We think it's a good idea to have the Corporation Council and the City Comptroller approve these renewals or extensions of emergency contracts. We're not sure of the exact time frame. I think 30 days, 90 days, whatever the appropriate amount is. I think the important thing is that that renewal takes place and it's for a short period of time, not these open-ended, very lengthy emergency contracts that we've seen. And we've been looking at this issue for a long time. We issued a report on it. We've supported contractor review, the pre-audit process of contracts before they go out the door at the state level, dating back to the Cuomo administration. This has been a practice that has really gotten much worse under COVID by governors and mayors across the country. And we think it reduces the integrity of contracts. And I think you saw with the previous administration, with the scandals that have occurred, that it's something that we need to address. And we would note for the particular bill 163 that we also think there should be a notice to the city record anytime there's a renewal of an emergency contract, which currently is only required as is practicable and frequently not done. For Intro 164, we support increasing the penalties. I mean, they're absurdly low at the moment, $100 to $1,000. That's, for a company, the cost of doing business for many of the large companies that are getting these emergency contracts. So certainly support an increase there. And then as far as the subcontractor information that the speaker is seeking in her bill, it appears to be required for one of the contract databases in Section 116.2 of Title VI, but not in the area where this bill would add it, which I think is the FISA database, so there may be value in adding it there as well. And then the last thing, our kind of proposal that's not currently in legislation, we suggest that the council also look at the doing business campaign contributions. Currently under the doing business law, emergency contracts are exempted from the lower campaign contribution limits. So if a company wanted to make donations to an elected official around the time of an emergency contract, they would not be subject to the lower campaign contribution limits. And so we think that should be addressed as well. Thank you, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you for that very thoughtful testimony. Last but not least, I'm happy the first nonprofit provider to come before the new contracts committee. Ms. Magnus, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, I was feeling a little out of place here, but I think I can fit in. I just do want to say good afternoon to you, Chair Ressler, and Council Member Gail Brewer. Got a long history of support with Northside. We are always honored to see you continue in your role. For 80 years, Northside has served New York City most vulnerable children and families, and today we serve about 1,000 each day across Manhattan, the Bronx, and Brooklyn, and through 20 school clinics and schools throughout the city for childhood programs and therapeutic services. Now, we don't get a lot of emergency one-time contracts, but as far as we're concerned, every contract we have is an emergency because it is serving the community that's most in need. And so we thought we would still speak to this issue because it affects getting your money. We applaud the speaker and the council member for addressing the procurement inefficiencies. We understand that emergency contract is limited, but it still has to have its important accountability Every dollar matters and needs to be accounted for. However, we urge the council to address how chronic underfunding combined with procurement delays can be a problem. We've heard some different pricing that was quoted here. Again, something that should be addressed, and some are underfunded, some are overfunded. What's going on with that? And again, every dollar mattering. So our reality is we operate contracts that fail to cover the true cost of service. Sometimes they're not transparent to see all the details, and we sometimes have to wait 8 to 12 months. I'm not sure about how all you wait for your contracts to be registered. I would hope their an emergency is done that day, but I don't know. But needless to say, if it takes that long to register a contract, we're in panic mode. And why is that? Because payroll has to be covered and operating costs have to be covered, not to mention you're competing for limited funds in this time. So when contracts take over a year to register and we must front the money, no payment is certain, and we're faced with choices, which is to either reduce staff, turn away children in crisis, and struggle, as I mentioned before, to meet payroll. So again, emergency situations, I'm sure they're even more important, but we strongly support transparency. That should be done with all contracts, emergency as well. It shouldn't take that long. I'm hearing 30, 90 days, whatever you all have found to be effective is what should be used, because we shouldn't be waiting long. And it should be able to track how long it is taken and how many organizations and subcontractor amounts and all the above. As you reform these emergency procurements, we urge you again also just to take a look at the cost, making sure they're fair, whether that involves MOCs, which we deal with daily, and also establishing a longer span of time wherever it's appropriate, so there's not all the bureaucracy with the paperwork, because that already takes up your emergency time. I do want to thank the leadership, as always, and Councilmember Brewer has been leading the city for many years. We can't thank you enough for your support, and I want to personally say that from Northside, but we always welcome the opportunity to work with whomever to provide solutions, because in the end, that's what it's all about. And I will comment on one city employee that I found that has been very much working with us. That's Michael Sidlow. He is the executive director of the not-for-profits here at the city. I don't think he's been in that position very long, but he needs to be kept, and there needs to be other staff hired like him. So I just want to give a good shout out where I see the city does some great things, because he picks up his phone, he actually answers it, and he will say, I can't do this, I can't do that, but I'll refer you to this person, and he follows up to make sure it happens. So I can't express enough how helpful he has been, and he's the person I call every time I have a problem with the city. So anyway, thank you all so much for this opportunity to speak before you.
I'll say he was hired by the de Blasio administration, and he stuck around. You know?
He's a good guy.
And worked at Mox for a very long time.
He knows what he's doing, and he responds.
I'm happy to hear that. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for your testimony. Do you want to ask any questions? I'll be brief. Firstly, Alex, just want to thank you for the thoughtful edits or suggestions, amendments to Councilmember Wan's bill, especially about the publication of contracts. I think that's a smart idea, and ensuring that the data is machine readable and downloadable is critically important. So just want to thank you for those helpful suggestions. I did just want to ask Charles, one suggestion would be to modify the time frame. You suggested 90 days. Another idea, I don't believe, I can't speak for the speaker, obviously, but I don't believe the intent of this legislation is around the demolition contracts. So if you take the localized incidents out and you consider emergency procurements that are based off of a mayoral executive order or a state of emergency that exists in the city, however smart lawyers would define that, which I am not one of, what do you think is an appropriate time frame for that kind of for that type of issue, for the COVID
Yeah.
situations, for the
Yeah.
monkeypox situations, or whatever it may be, public health emergencies.
Completely. And Chair, I think you're hitting the nail on the head, which is, and my personal opinion is, I don't think timeline is necessarily the cause of the issue as much as a symptom. So, to my opinion, my personal opinion was I wouldn't put any timeline on it because, again, I think the law department and the controller's office already do a pretty darn good job of saying after 90 days they're going to be they're going to be saying, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And if you have great answers to that, the bonding situation, where actually I need this for 2 years because it's about this thing or this random thing, then we should kind of keep that alive. My personal opinion is we should not necessarily, I don't think the timing is the issue.
If it was a time limitation, then you wouldn't be able to do bonding at all.
Yes,
right?
And
Because
then you'd have
the
to do a
contract wouldn't-
completely different form of contract type. So I'd say this, the reason you do an emergency is how fast you need it in the shortest term, not necessarily how long it's going to last.
Right.
In that regard, I think we put an unfair burden on the controller and the corporation counsel. It makes great sense. In 1989, we say, okay, we have a lot of process with procurement. We need an off-ramp. So long as the controller and the corp counsel say it's okay, I'm sure it'll be fine. That makes sense. I might have had the same logic, but I think for the reasons we've been discussing, they are not best placed to be saying, hey, NISM's doing something kind of similar, not even with an emergency contract, with something else, and they're getting a better price than this. The law department's they're not going to have that in front of them, even if they do have structural knowledge of it. And to an extent, the controller does. Again, it's already somewhat adversarial. It's not quite the same thing. So I think the issue is not necessarily the legal sufficiency. Even with .go, the controller didn't feel comfortable. I'll let him speak for himself, but at least did not deny prior or final approval. He failed to register it. In that sense, I'm guessing, because again, it's not like the legal sufficiency wasn't there. It was just a bad idea. And to that extent, I do think the way that we solve this gargantuan issue, and I think the speaker said it very well, we went from from COVID, we're taking a breath, saying let's write up some plans, get some more on-call contracts, and then asylum hit. And I think I don't think we're that, we know what we need to do. We need more on-call contracts. We need more things that allow us to take advantage of our purchasing power, to negotiate way before we need it tomorrow, which is really when it costs us money. But fundamentally, I think we need a procurement expert to be taking the ball on the mayoral side. Because at the end of the day, an agency I'll tell the famous story. Someone asked me about what's Mox's involvement in PPP 306. It doesn't exist in there. It's not in Charter 315 because the charter doesn't conceive of Mox. It considers the mayor approving it, right? And Mox exists to apply that approval. Agencies wouldn't consider that it's a feature, not a flaw. What's the best part about a PPP 306? I don't have to worry about Mox. They only have to worry about two people, law department and the controller. Right. And they're not necessarily asking those questions. So I do think we need to take a harder look at the structure of who is approving it, who is accountable for this, because I don't think we have the right people kind of in those positions, having been in the positions of having to try and approve it or not approve it. But I would, so I don't think timeline is the cause. I think it's a symptom, but I do believe we do need to do something, but I do think 90 days is the lowest I would go in that regard, because I think before that, then it's just false, because there's no other option. Something that takes 68 days, it's not going to be any different than 30, because it's going to be an emergency contract nonetheless, because as you well know, a normal contract is going to be taking you so much longer. So I don't think we can separate the DOB demolition from the COVID and that way, but we have to.
If I could just jump in on that, I think with the DOB demolition, I'm not aware of any scandals or issues around that type of contract. You could do something where you could.
That's all. HPD does the demolition contract, just for the
It
record.
is correct.
It doesn't matter. But
Completely.
I think you could potentially, apply different time frames or not have as frequent renewals for those types of contracts, or you could look at it from a dollar threshold. Obviously, we're concerned about the largest contracts. Look, the director called I think the DOCO contract an outlier, but if you look at these things by dollar value, I would imagine that there are many emergency contracts that have a very high dollar value, and maybe the more frequent number is these demolition contracts.
Yeah, we should take a look at how many HPD does. I over the years worked with Vito and Anne Marie a lot on these different times when the demolitions were necessary and their team would make it happen. But no, as I think I've said now 16 times in the hearing, we wouldn't be having this hearing today if we were talking about HPD demolitions. We're having the hearing about the 763 contracts totaling $5.7 billion under Eric Adams on emergency relating to the migrant crisis, and how that money has unfortunately been misspent too many times, and all of the limitations we know exist with emergency procurements that are not as rigorous as our standard procurement process. So, you know, we are where we are. I think that I do think that there are unanticipated implications with a tight time frame that we need to think through very carefully. We also want to make sure that there's ongoing review and oversight, and that we're trying to transition those contracts to standard procurements as soon as is feasible. So how do we balance all of that is what we're going to have to figure out as this legislation gets negotiated and we move it forward. And we'll look to solicit feedback from the law department and the controller's office that have the most direct expertise on these topics. And I'm sorry they weren't with us today. I guess the one other thing I'd love to ask is just so the controller did not register an emergency procurement for .go, right? And it had no impact.
Yeah, I can speak to that. And you had said it very well. And you've been around city government where you know that term, deemed registered, right? The city can normally kind of overpower a failure to register a normal contract. That's built into the 89 charter, and I think it goes with the spirit of it, was the idea that the controller can use their bully pulpit to say, I think something's wrong, but they can't stop it absent a very specific thing about corruption, which has only, I think, ever been triggered once since 89. So yes, normally you can override it. What happened with .go, and again, you asked the question of what happens if you fail to approve.
Right.
In my experience, sir, what I would say is that if either the law department or the controller fails to approve at either of their two stages, prior approval, which is me saying, here's the need, can I go pick up the phone? And final approval, which is me saying, okay, here's the deal I got. At both of those times, if either of the entities says no, you are dead in the water and you have to start from scratch. That is how it works with an emergency procurement. The reason that did not happen with .go is because the controller did approve it and then failed to register it, which meant you can deem it registered. Because what is registration ultimately? It is the act of putting it in FMS. Right. Can you write a check? Can you cut a check off of it? Which is why it's so crucially important. But in that sense, again, so the contract was legally effective. Now, I will say this. I'll leave it to the law department. There's more legal nuance than that, but suffice it to say, yeah, and that's why it's a little bit different. But I'd often say this, Chair. There is no contract in the entire city of New York where the controller has more power than an emergency contract. And that's been true since 89.
And this legislation would give dramatically more power to the controller's office. Understood. I think you explained that crystally clear. So thank you for edifying me and on the record.
Just
happy to, if you have any final comments from the panel?
Yeah, just one other thing. I think that would help the council's oversight. I mean, we mentioned in our testimony that, the contracts under the charter are supposed to be made available online.
Yeah.
Certainly the council can acquire them more so than the general public and see provisions that wouldn't otherwise be available to the general public. But I've been on the other side of contracting. I've done this for companies, for vendors, for telecommunications companies, real estate companies, construction companies in different capacities. And almost all of these contracts have standards written into them, performance standards. And usually there's provisions in contracts that also enable either side to get out of the contract within a certain period of time. So if there's a highly visible contract where there's been a scandal and the council gets a copy of it, they can see the performance metrics. They can see the ability of the city to get out of the contract, and they can use that for their oversight purposes.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, look, I think we all know the city can essentially discontinue a contract at a moment's notice whenever it sees fit for whatever reason it so determines. And that's, as I understand it, baked into basically every city contract. Charles can correct me.
I would briefly note that, of course, the de Blasio, famously with that concession, the former Trump golf course, city ended up having to pay $20 to $25 million, in my personal opinion, Chair, because they used the wrong out, which is that there was at will, but it was decided to use it because they breached the rule of law provisions, blah, blah, blah. The reason I say is that although I would agree the city should be very aggressive in getting out of our contracts when we see fit, and indeed sometimes eating a fee, it is true also that courts, that's a famous example where we got hurt harder than the contract would have hurt us otherwise, simply by trying to withdraw. But we should certainly use that tool aggressively. Yeah.
I raise that to say, we know the city essentially has that power. The question of kind of when it's used and what are the implications of its use in areas where we have a hard time recruiting and retaining vendors like shelter operations, or where there could be real term consequential impacts like childcare providers. Like, we have to be really deliberate, and the management on the administration side, the leadership, deputy mayors, commissioners, have to be very careful in when they use those oversight functions. And I imagine that previous administrations have been reticent to be as transparent as they could be, because they're not trying to create a lot of outside pressure to prevent that could make it harder for them to defend difficult decisions. It's not to say it's right. It's not to say it's wrong. I'm not defending it. I'm just trying to kind of think through and explain it to myself. But you're right. It's required that this information be public. It should be public. It should be easily accessible and searchable. And information that needs to be redacted should be redacted. And it should be as simple as that. Such as, shelter locations shouldn't be made available, even if we know where they all are anyway. That's not in the spirit of, the state law that provides some protection and privacy to recipients of public assistance. So with that, I think we will thank this esteemed and informative panel. We really appreciate your time today. Last but not least, one of our great frequent flyers across the City Council as a whole, Christopher Leon Johnson.
Thank you, Chairs Brewer and Wrestler. My name is Christopher Leon Johnson. I'm calling this city council. I support the bills. This need to be done. I don't know why that they didn't do this under Eric Adams' administration, but we moved on. He moved on. He's no longer here. We have the Madani administration now. I hope that when this bills get passed, Madani lets us go through. He doesn't veto these bills. Look. I'm calling on the city council to make it call for people to start disclosing themselves more as lobbyists in the city council. I'm calling on the city council to make it where that there's two people that should be registered as lobbyists in the city of New York. Ben Furness of Transportation Alternatives, Lygia Galapa of Worker Justice Project, Law Certificate in Nistos. And because there's a bill, I think there's a bill that's introduced by Julie Menon when it comes to subcontractors. And I want to call Mr. Lincoln Wrestler to start asking these transportation alternatives why, and Lygia Galapa, why they don't register themselves as a nonprofit themselves as the Worker Justice Project when it comes to getting these contracts and discretionary funding, and why they hiding under Durst New England. Basically, I believe that it shouldn't be like that. If they being recognized at the city and they'll say, "Oh, we're recognized by the city of New York," they should be registered as the Worker Justice Project instead of Durst New England, because a lot of people get thrown off when it comes to discretionary funds get doled out and contracts get doled out. You have to search up through Durst New England, and I think that this should be part of that too, where the Worker Justice Project must be accounted for when it comes to getting contracts from the city, because they should be, if they don't want to be, they should be registered as a subcontractor. Because where's that money going? They get $1 million in money all the time. Where's that money going? And you start asking Ben Furness, who is the owner of Transportation Alternatives, who works and oversees the Work Justice Project, and ask Lygia Galapa, where's that money going? You're getting all that money from the city from discretionary funding, and where's that money going? So that's all I got to say.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I will just say there are requirements around the legal names of organizations and how those are used, and there are requirements around who needs to register as a lobbyist and what activities you're necessitate that. And so I imagine these organizations are very well informed about what those criteria are, but appreciate your testimony today and the suggestion, and thank you for joining us at the hearing.
Thank you.
With that, we will adjourn our first Contracts Committee hearing of 2026.